Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching America 360 on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of the hour. US Energy Secretary Chris Wright says the US is not conducting nuclear explosions after President Trump's call for weapons testing stoked global fears. He says the tests are non-critical and Nevada residents do not need to worry. US President Donald Trump says he doubts war with Venezuela, but warns President Nicolas Maduro's days are numbered. This comes as the US builds its largest military presence in the Caribbean in decades amid strikes on drug smuggling boats. The US government shutdown is deepening the financial crisis for court-appointed lawyers defending indigent clients. Many have stopped taking new cases as funding shortfalls threaten the right to effective legal counsel. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei says cooperation with the United States is impossible while it supports Israel and maintains bases in the region. He adds that Washington's interference in the Middle East makes any partnership unthinkable. Actor George Clooney says it was a mistake for Kamala Harris to replace Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee against Donald Trump. The actor stands by his op-ed urging Biden to quit, but says Harris faced an impossible task running on her record. President Trump says he doesn't know Binance founder Changpeng Zhao, despite pardoning him last month. Zhao, who served 4 months for money laundering, has business ties to Trump-linked digital currency firms. The US Supreme Court takes up a major challenge to President Donald Trump's global tariffs in what could be the biggest battle yet of his trade war. Small businesses and states argue the tariffs are illegal and should be struck down, a ruling that could force billions in refunds and redefine presidential power. US President Donald Trump doubled down, stating that the US military could deploy troops in Nigeria or even carry out airstrikes to stop the alleged killings of Christians in the country. Now, Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, says cooperation with the United States is not possible while Washington continues to back Israel, maintain military bases and interfere in the Middle East. Speaking in Tehran, the Iranian supreme leader dismissed recent US overtures for dialogue. Let's take a listen in to his statements.
آمریکایی‌ها میگن گاهی البته همیشه نه گاهی میگن مایلیم با ایران همکاری کنیم همکاری با ایران با همکاری و کمک به رژیم صهیونی ملعون سازگار نیست با این وضع همراهی با ایران معنی نداره قابل قبول نیست بله اگر چنانچه به کلی پشتیبانی از رژیم صهیونیستی رو کنار بگذاره.
Now his comments come as President Donald Trump says Washington is still open to a deal with Tehran, quote, when it's ready. The two sides have held 5 rounds of nuclear talks, but progress stalled after a 12-day conflict between Iran and Israel in June. Disagreements over uranium enrichment remain a key sticking point in the relationship. We are now joined by Mohammed Osman. He's an international relations expert and he joins us live from Cairo. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the program. Now, the United States' relationship with Iran is long and complicated. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, things have been tumultuous to say the least. However, under Donald Trump 2.0, where we've seen nuclear bases bombed, we've seen a huge alliance to Israel, of course, the Trump administration. Is a Washington-Tehran relationship ever going to be possible in at least this Trump 2.0 administration? And what would it be like? What would it look like?
Thank you for having me, Thomas. Always a pleasure to be with you. Welcome back. It doesn't seem that I cannot really imagine the United States being able to maintain a working relationship with Iran at this point, given that with the recent history in hindsight, you just mentioned the 12-day war that Israel launched against Iran, and in the closing day of the war, the United States joined in destroying the nuclear underground facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. And basically, this happened in the midst of a negotiation between the United States and Iran. So we can understand why Iran has a lot of trust issues with the United States, because in the midst of a negotiating process that was reportedly moving positively, according to Steve Witkoff, according to Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and yet we were surprised by Israel launching a preemptive act of aggression against Iran, of course this came in violation of international law, and definitely did sabotage all the diplomatic endeavors to find a political solution to the Iran nuclear issue. So now, as things stand, the United States, it seems, seeks to reopen the door for dialogue and try to push Iran once more to go for a deal. However, the United States still maintains the same conditions. It insists on zero enrichment and basically the de-assembly of the Iranian nuclear program effectively. And of course, this is something that Iran will never concede to for understandable reasons, because they're not getting anything in return. If anything, they are being subjected to some sort of blackmail and pressure. I am no fan of the Iranian regime. However, I do understand why they would be very reluctant to engage in dialogue with the United States right now, because they do not really trust that the U.S. is sincere about it. The last time the United States did this, it was a cover basically for a war against Iran. And probably this time it might be the same, at least in the psyche and in the inner mind of the Iranian decision makers. However, also it would be rather foolhardy to completely reject all the U.S. overtures with what we've heard from the Ayatollah today, the supreme leader of Iran. It'll be very dangerous just to slam the Americans and completely dismiss them and dismiss their overtures for talks, because now you will give the Americans and the Israelis all the necessary pretexts in order to carry out another war against Iran, which Israel, by the way, is itching to do. Israel feels that it was not allowed to finish the job last time, that the regime in Iran sustained substantial damage, and the Iranian military and state did sustain substantial damage. And had the war gone on, at least according to the Israeli imagination or calculations rather, the regime would have fallen. Of course, this course of thinking is questionable and up for debates, and one can argue against Israel's logic all day. However, that's what they believe, and what they believe is what matters, because this is what may lead to another war. So things are looking really bad with regards to Iran in this region, Thomas.
Indeed, and Mohammed, of course, you cite lack of trust there. Of course, a huge problem between Washington and Tehran. However, there is growing ties emerging, and that's Iran's growing ties with Russia and China. Is Tehran's foreign policy now moving beyond resistance and towards a new strategic bloc opposed to Western influence?
They have always been in that bloc, if we even can call that a bloc. It is rather a loose friendship or camaraderie, basically, between a few states or many states even that do not agree with the United States unilateral policies when it comes to international relations and even international commerce with what's going on with Trump right now. So several countries do attempt to find alternatives. But can we speak of an actual access and actual alliance between Iran, Russia, and China? I think that's a gross overstatement, if you ask me, because there is no treaty of alliance between those countries. And when Israel was pummeling Iran a few months ago, Beijing and Moscow were nowhere to be found. They were missing in action. They condemned Israel, definitely, that they did. And that's about it. Maybe now they are helping the Iranians refurbish their military capabilities, restock their missile stockpiles and anti-air defense rocket stockpiles. However, I cannot really imagine Russia or China going to war over Iran. And even though they did stand by Iran in this E3 fiasco, when the Europeans decided to reactivate the snapback mechanism, which is basically to the detriment of the entire diplomatic process, as when they stood by the Iranians. However, I do not see anything beyond these symbolic acts of solidarity. Maybe this time, if another confrontation happens, they will be more serious about supplying Iran with more weapons. However, nothing will save Iran, nothing short of an actual intervention by those countries in the case of a conflict. And then we're talking about World War III, which is not going to happen.
Mohammed Osman, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to speak to you, and thank you for taking the time. Now, next, we have another story coming out of the United States, where courts in 2 United States are holding hearings today over the legality of National Guard deployments ordered under President Donald Trump's new crime-fighting initiative. In Tennessee, a state court is hearing a lawsuit challenging Governor Bill Lee's decision to send Guard troops into Memphis, where they've been patrolling neighborhoods since early October as part of Trump's Memphis Safe Task Force. Critics argue the governor exceeded his powers, saying such deployments are only legal in cases of rebellion or invasion. Meanwhile, in West Virginia, a court is reviewing a challenge to Governor Patrick Morrisey's move to send up to 300 Guard members to Washington in August. A civic group says that the deployment violates state law, while the state argues it's backed by federal authority. The hearings come as Trump continues to defend his plan to use the National Guard in Democratic-run cities, even as federal data shows violent crime in the capital is at a 30-year low. Okay, now joining us here to discuss this is Ross Feingold. He is a political analyst and he joins us live from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here on the programme. Ross, hearings are set to commence to examine the action of this National Guard deployment in Washington, D.C. and Memphis in particular. However, these deployments have occurred elsewhere as well. How significant are these oversight efforts in defining the limits of federal authority under the Donald Trump 2.0 administration? And what does that say about Donald Trump's wider relationship with the American judiciary and what the outcomes might be of this?
The district courts have come down in different ways on this question, so ultimately this might have to be litigated up to the Supreme Court level. But we have to be realistic. The Supreme Court, with a 6-3 conservative majority, if it does reach the Supreme Court, might very well rule in favor of the Trump administration's interpretation of applicable laws. But another really factual aspect of this is very often by the time this goes through the courts, the deployment is done. So whether it's from a public safety perspective or from a legal perspective, the goals of the Trump administration have already been achieved by the time there's a court ruling on this. So for the opponents, unfortunately for them, very often this is an exercise in futility. And for the Trump administration, they consider it a political victory, which is a very long way of saying that at the end of the exercise, we're kind of right back where we started.
Yeah, and Ross, of course, these, as you've said, these deployments don't last too long. And of course, are sent to Democratic-ran cities. What do they achieve for Donald Trump and his administration?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and frankly, it's going to take a lot of academic analysis to really answer it. But I think a lot of people across the country, not necessarily in the cities where these troops are deployed, but across the country, especially in places that voted for Trump in 2024, they're going to say, what was the downside? There was more public security. Certainly, it reduces crime. And opponents are going to say, but crime was falling anyway, and this was unnecessary. But the Trump administration is going to say it helped public safety. And based on how people voted in the last presidential election, we have to be realistic. Half of the electorate is going to say Trump did the right thing.
Realistically, do you think these hearings could change how the Trump administration approaches protests, approaches unrest? Of course, we saw one of the first deployments was in Los Angeles, and that followed protests about the ICE raids. Donald Trump, many of his critics say, as you've mentioned, he is an anomaly when it comes to following the judiciary. Do you think that this court decision, if it is not made in his favor, he will follow along with the result?
Again, speaking realistically, these cases will ultimately go up to the Supreme Court. And with a 6-3 conservative majority, it's very likely that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the Trump administration's interpretation of applicable law. So from a political, not a legal, but a political perspective, one would have to tell President Trump that you might as well go for it. You might as well continue the policies you've been pursuing, because it's a very high likelihood that the Supreme Court is going to rule in your favor. And that's what we see the Trump administration doing. So even if there's a lower court ruling against...
Okay, we've had some network issues, I believe. Hopefully we get Ross back in just a few seconds, but we will move on to our next story. And a federal judge in Oregon has once again blocked the Trump administration from deploying National Guard troops to Portland. This temporary ban will remain in place until at least Friday, when the court is expected to issue a final ruling. The decision to ban deployment troops follows a 3-day trial that examined whether protests in Portland met the conditions for using federal troops under U.S. law. The city and state filed a lawsuit back in September seeking to stop the deployment. Additionally, the federal judge, Karin Immergut, who is a Trump appointee, has said that most violence occurred between protesters and counter-protesters with little damage to federal property. In response, the Trump administration has argued that troops were needed to protect federal facilities, but the court concluded that conditions did not meet the legal standard for the military deployment. The ongoing case is part of a broader legal challenge involving other cities, such as Chicago, which have also questioned the federalization of the National Guard earlier on in the year. Okay, Ross Feingold joins us once again. Ross, a federal judge in Oregon has once again blocked the Trump administration from deploying these national groups in Portland in the state of Oregon. How significant is this ruling in terms of limiting presidential power here?
Seen, because the Trump administration will appeal it. Even if the Trump administration eventually loses, which frankly we don't know, and if it goes to the Supreme Court, the Trump administration might actually win. But the Trump administration is still going to declare a political victory, because they'll say, well, we had our troops on the ground for a few days and we disagree with the court ruling. So we do have to separate the political side from the legal side. And from the Trump administration's perspective, they really have no downside to doing this. Or Oregon is not a state that voted for Trump anyway. So Trump doesn't, and his team, they don't see much downside from pursuing this policy, even if they ultimately lose in the courts.
Yeah, and the Justice Department argued that the troops were needed to protect these federal facilities. Do you think this defense holds any legal weight under existing U.S. law?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question because we would like to think our judges in America are nonpartisan. We would like to think that they apply the law, they look at precedent, previous court cases, but the reality is that judges have their biases. They are either liberal or conservative. And if you get a conservative judge, it'll rule in the Trump administration's favor. If you get a liberal judge, it will rule against the Trump administration. But if this goes to the Supreme Court with a conservative majority, it's highly likely they will rule in favor of the Trump administration.
And Ross, of course, we've seen governors, we've seen mayors speak out about these deployments. Do you think could another branch step in here? Could Congress step in to clarify limits on the executive's power here to deploy these guards domestically, or is this merely an executive power?
This will be a standoff between the executive branch and the judicial branch. The legislative branch really has limited ability to intervene, especially if the legislative branch, both houses of the House and the Senate, have a Republican majority. If after the midterm election, which is 12 months from now, there's a split and there's one House, the Senate has a Republican majority, but the House of Representatives has a Democrat majority, it's still going to be split. They won't be able to pass any legislation opposing the Trump administration. So again, for now, if you're the Trump administration, you're thinking you're in a good position here.
Ross Feingold, it's always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you very much for such brilliant insight. We, of course, stay in the United States for our next story. And Hollywood star George Clooney said it was a mistake for Kamala Harris to replace Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee in last year's US presidential election against Donald Trump. Clooney, who had urged Biden to step aside in a July 2024 op-ed, says he still stands by that call but believes Harris faced an impossible challenge running against her own record. In his New York Times piece titled, "I love you, Joe Biden, but we need a new nominee," Clooney wrote that Biden had fought many battles but couldn't win the fight against time. Less than 2 weeks later, Biden withdrew and Harris became the nominee, eventually losing to Donald Trump, of course. Clooney's latest remarks come after Hunter Biden criticized him for questioning his father's mental fitness. Despite the backlash, Clooney says he would write the same op-ed again, calling it a missed opportunity for Democrats. Now we move on. Huggies maker Kimberly-Clark announces that it will buy Tylenol's parent company, Kevin in a $48.7 billion deal, creating a massive consumer products conglomerate. The acquisition comes after a few weeks after President Donald Trump made unfounded claims linking autism to Tylenol use during pregnancy, otherwise known as paracetamol, sending Kenvue's stock sharply lower. According to a statement by both the companies, the combined business will bring together $10 billion brands and will drive annual revenue of $32 billion. The new company will make products that touch nearly half the global population through every stage of life, including Johnson's baby products, Clean and Clear skincare, Kleenex, Listerine, mouthwash, and Depends adult diapers. The cash and stock deal has Kimberly-Clark paying $21.01 for each Kenvue share, a hefty premium over the $14.37 of its Friday closing price. Now we move on. Emergency crews rush to Rome after the partial collapse of a medieval tower near the Colosseum leaves one worker seriously injured and another trapped under rubble. The 29-metre Torre dei Conti, dating back to the 13th century, suffered 2 collapses during restoration work. Regional President Francesco Rota says the hospitalised worker is now in stable condition, while 2 others sustained minor injuries. Firefighters continue rescue efforts, but officials warn of further collapses as the structure remains unstable. Videos shared online show clouds of dust and falling masonry as parts of the historic tower gave way. Once a City Hall building, the Torre dei Conti has been closed since 2006 and is currently under renovation in a project expected to finish next year. Authorities have now sealed off the area around one of Rome's most famous landmarks to ensure public safety. And now that is a wrap on America 360. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.